The coin hit the wooden table with a sound that silenced every drunk, every gambler, and every soul in Murphy's saloon. A single silver dollar. But it wasn't the money that made 30 men stop breathing. It was the black hand that slammed it down. Josiah Freeman stood 6 feet tall in a room where his skin made him an enemy before he even opened his mouth. His weathered fingers wrapped around the silver coin, the only thing between him and a fight that could cost him more than just his life. The smell of whiskey and sweat filled the air, thick with tension. The saloon was alive with noise, the clink of glasses, low murmurs, the shuffle of cards. But Josiah didn't hear any of it. His eyes were fixed on the stage at the far end of the room. Rose O'Malley stood there, blonde hair matted with sweat, her blue dress torn at the shoulder. She looked like a fawn caught in a trap, and every man in the room could see it. She was the prize, the object of their twisted game. Josiah's heart pounded in his chest. He had survived slavery, fought in 2 range wars, and built a cattle operation that most white men envied. But standing in this saloon, surrounded by men who traded in human misery, felt like being thrust back into a cage. The auctioneer, Cornelius Whitmore, was a greasy man whose face seemed permanently stuck in a smile. But Josiah saw the ugliness in his eyes. Josiah's fingers tightened around the coin in his hand. "Do I hear 800? Whitmore called out. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Josiah could feel the tension building. The men gathered around the stage, their eyes hungry, calculating. The girl, Rose, stood there with her head slightly lowered, her eyes hollow but alert. She knew this moment was her fate, like a piece of livestock just waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. 1,000, Josiah said, his voice cutting through the smoke-filled air like a blade. The room froze. Even the drunks seemed to hold their breath. But Whitmore didn't blink. He smiled, his lips pulling tight over yellowed teeth. "Well now, that's mighty generous of you, boy. But this here auction ain't just about money." Josiah's stomach tightened. His gut was telling him something had just shifted. Rose's eyes flicked to him, then away. Something flickered behind them. Curiosity, not hope, but it was there like a brief spark in a storm. The auctioneer's eyes darted around the room, reading the faces of the men. These weren't just cowboys. There were men in suits here, businessmen, landowners, men who ran towns. "This girl," Whitmore continued, "has debts. Family debts. Ain't that right, Rose?" His words were slow and deliberate, and the room seemed to lean in closer. Rose's head jerked up at the mention of her father, her lips trembling as she shook her head. "My father never signed," Whitmore interrupted, pulling a crumpled paper from his jacket. "Your father borrowed 300 to bury your mother, girl. Sign this contract. Said if he couldn't pay, his daughter would work it off. And now, well, your debts are being sold." The lie hung in the air like a heavy weight. Josiah could feel the bile rise in his throat. This wasn't just an auction. It was a trap, a game built on false contracts and desperation. "I'll pay the debt," Josiah said, his voice strong, steady. 1,300. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Whitmore's face flickered with confusion. "Debts aren't for sale to your kind, boy." Josiah's jaw clenched. "My kind? You mean the kind with money?" The room went still. Every eye in the saloon was now on him. He knew what he was up against. Every man here was either a coward or a criminal. But he wasn't going to back down. Not again. Not this time. But before Whitmore could respond, a voice cut through the silence. Well, looks like we got a troublemaker." Deputy Marshal Kane stepped into the saloon, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. Josiah's blood ran cold. Kane's face was familiar, too familiar. He'd heard whispers about this man. He wasn't a lawman. He was Whitmore's right hand. "Trouble, Cornelius?" Kane asked, his voice smooth, like a snake that had learned how to charm its prey. Josiah's hand instinctively went to his gun, but there were too many men between him and the door. Too many eyes watching, too many guns waiting to be drawn. He could feel the noose tightening, but he couldn't let go. Rose's eyes met his. There was no fear in them now, just a quiet, resigned understanding. This was her life. This was the world she had been born into. But it wasn't his world anymore. Not if he could help it. "What do you say, boy?" Cain asked, drawing closer. "You really want to make trouble in here?" Josiah's fingers curled around the handle of his Colt, ready for what might come next. He had no backup, no hope of surviving a shootout with this many men. But Rose's eyes were on him, and he couldn't walk away. "Not now. I'll pay the debt," Josiah repeated, louder this time. "I'll pay it all." Whitmore's sneer spread. "The debt isn't for sale, Freeman." But Josiah wasn't about to give up. He was done running. He placed the silver coin back on the table, his hand steady as he prepared for whatever would come next. And so, in the heart of Dusty Creek, the auction began to spiral into something more. A dangerous game where the stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated. Josiah's heart pounded in his chest, every beat like the rhythm of a war drum. He had faced more than his share of enemies in his life, but nothing felt quite like this. His fingers hovered over the gun, but he didn't pull it. Yet. Not yet. Whitmore's smug grin stretched wider as he stepped back, enjoying the tension in the room. The drunken men were now watching the exchange with the kind of eagerness usually reserved for a fistfight. The air was thick with smoke and anticipation, but underneath it all was a sense of dread, a sense that this was something far darker than an auction for a woman. This was a battle for power, for control over a life. Cain stood casually by the door, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the scene unfold. His stance was confident, like a man who knew how the game was played and had no intention of losing. The rest of the room followed suit, a collective murmur rising from the onlookers as they waited for someone to blink. Josiah was the first to speak, his voice low but steady. "I said I'll pay it. The girl's not for sale. You're selling a life, and I'm not letting that happen." His words cut through the tension like a blade. The auctioneer, Whitmore, raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. His hands twitched toward his waist, as if calculating his next move. "What's your plan, Freeman?" he sneered, his voice laced with condescension. "You think you can just buy your way out of this mess? You think you can walk in here, with your kind, and make a mockery of my business?" Josiah's teeth ground together, a fire sparking in his chest. This was more than just money. It was more than a simple transaction. This was about principle. The things his father had taught him, honor, integrity, standing up for the powerless, pushed him to this point. He had nothing left to lose. But Rose? She was a person, not a commodity. "I'll make sure she's free," Josiah said, his voice gaining strength. "But I'm not walking away until you understand something, Whitmore. This isn't just about dollars and cents. You're dealing with more than a businessman now. This is personal." The room went quiet as his words sank in, the implications hanging in the air. The men looked at each other, sensing the shift. There was a reason Josiah Freeman had earned a reputation across 3 counties. He didn't back down. And now, standing in front of them, he wasn't the quiet rancher who worked the land. He was the storm they'd all been waiting to face. Rose shifted on the stage, her gaze flickering between Josiah and the men around her. It was the first time she'd moved since the bidding began. Her eyes, once clouded with resignation, were now sharpened with something else, defiance, a spark of life. She didn't know him, didn't trust him, but for the first time in days, she didn't feel completely alone. She didn't feel like just a piece of property being passed from hand to hand. Whitmore's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, his greasy fingers rubbing the back of his neck. He was a man who lived for control, and Josiah's words were threatening that. He glanced at Dalton, a rancher known for his ruthlessness, and then back at Josiah. "Looks like we got ourselves a situation," Whitmore drawled, his smile gone but replaced with a cold, calculating look. "But let me tell you something, Freeman. You may have money, but around here, money ain't what matters. Men like you don't belong in places like this. You're about to learn that the hard way." Cain, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "That's right, Freeman. You may think you're above it all, but in the end, this is just business. You try to ruin that, and you'll regret it." But Josiah wasn't backing down. His hand rested on his Colt, and the weight of it felt like an anchor. He knew the risks. He was outnumbered, surrounded by men whose violence was well practiced, but he had no other choice. He couldn't turn his back now. not when Rose was counting on him. Suddenly, the saloon door creaked open, and the room's tension shifted. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall and weathered, with a presence that seemed to stop time. It was Judge Harrison Blackwood, the man whose reputation was known even in the farthest corners of the territory. His gray beard was framed by the soft glow of lamplight, and his eyes, sharp and cold, swept the room with the kind of authority that made even the boldest men hesitate. "Kane," the judge's voice boomed, heavy with authority. "What's going on here?" Kane straightened immediately, though there was no fear in his eyes, only a cold recognition. "Just a little trouble, Judge. This man," Kane nodded toward Josiah, "is interfering with an official auction." Blackwood's eyes didn't leave Josiah's face. He seemed to recognize something in the man, a glimmer of truth or justice that cut through the murky politics of the room. "I don't care about your auction, Kane," Blackwood said, his voice like thunder. "What I care about is what's going on here. Whitmore, what's this all about?" Whitmore's face twisted. He knew the judge wasn't someone to be trifled with. Blackwood had a reputation for cracking down on corruption, and he wasn't afraid to hang men like Whitmore, who thought they were above the law. Josiah knew this was his moment. With Blackwood's presence in the room, he finally had a chance to turn the tide. The men who'd been on edge for so long, who'd been waiting for a fight, were now looking to their judge for guidance. They weren't just cowards. They were also businessmen who understood the value of their own lives, and they knew better than to cross Blackwood. But Whitmore wasn't giving up easily. He wasn't one to back down without a fight, and neither was Josiah. The tension in the room was so thick it was almost tangible, and Josiah felt every second stretch out before him. "Judge," Whitmore started, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "this man thinks he could just walk in here and ruin my business. He doesn't belong in this town." Josiah didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Rose, his eyes softening for a brief moment. There was no way he could let her suffer any longer, not when there was a chance to stop this. The others in the room began to move, sensing that the tables were turning. Josiah wasn't the one with something to lose anymore. He was the one with something to gain, justice. He stepped forward. "You can either take your men and walk out now, Whitmore, or I'll make sure you regret ever trying to play me like this." The silence hung in the air like a cloud of dust, thick and heavy, with only the distant crackle of the fire in the hearth breaking the stillness. Every eye in the saloon was on Josiah Freeman, the quiet rancher who had dared to stand up against men far more dangerous than he had any right to challenge. His hand rested lightly on his Colt, fingers ready, his heart steady, but his thoughts ran wild. Rose watched him with eyes wide, a mixture of awe and disbelief on her face. Just moments ago, she had been resigned to her fate, just another victim in the long line of women whose lives had been bargained for in these places of cruelty. But Josiah's arrival had shattered her world. His courage, his defiance, his refusal to accept the corruption around him, it had all ignited something inside her that she hadn't known was still there. "Get out of here, Freeman," Whitmore sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't know what you're dealing with. These men don't care about your money, your morals, or your heroics. They care about what they've paid for, and you're about to learn that lesson the hard way." Josiah didn't flinch. "I'm not here to make a deal," he said, his voice cold and calm. "I'm here to end this." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. He had underestimated Josiah from the start, thinking he could be bought, thinking his money would silence the black cowboy who had always fought for what was right. But Josiah was different. Josiah wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been sold and silenced by men like Whitmore. Dalton, the rancher who had sat quietly in the back, his greasy face twisted in a permanent sneer, was the first to make a move. He reached for his gun, the heavy weight of it familiar and comforting in his hand. Josiah's eyes never left him, and his instincts screamed. "You're making a big mistake, Dalton," Josiah said softly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "This isn't just about money anymore. You know it, I know it. And in the end, none of us are getting out of here without a price." Dalton chuckled, his hand already on the handle of his gun. "The only price, Freeman, is the one you'll pay with your life." But before he could draw, Blackwood stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun at his side, but his eyes locked on Josiah. "Dalton, step back," the judge ordered, his voice low but firm. "This is no longer your show to run." Dalton hesitated, but the authority in Blackwood's voice was unmistakable. He scowled, but he didn't argue. Josiah could see the fear flicker in his eyes. This wasn't just about a fight for control anymore. It was about survival. Whitmore looked furious, but seemed to realize the odds were now shifting. His eyes flicked toward the door, calculating, but he made no move to leave. The room had shifted. Now, it was just a matter of who would make the first move. And that's when Josiah heard it. Something deeper than the thrum of his own pulse. Something colder. The sound of boots, marching steadily, coming closer, closing in on the saloon. Josiah turned toward the door, his eyes narrowing. The figures appeared in the doorway like a storm on the horizon. 6 riders, black hats, and glinting guns, led by none other than his brother, Marcus. Josiah's heart skipped a beat. He recognized him immediately, the cold smile on his older brother's face as he stepped into the saloon, flanked by his men. Well, Marcus called out, his voice smooth, almost mockingly friendly. "I see you've managed to stir up quite a little mess, little brother." Josiah's stomach twisted. Marcus had been gone for years, and in that time, he had chosen a darker path, working with Whitmore, running with the wrong men. Josiah had tried to help, tried to bring him back into the fold of family and honor, but his brother had rejected it all. Now he was standing on the other side, an enemy Josiah could barely recognize. "Marcus," Josiah said, his voice tight with emotion. "You didn't have to do this. You didn't have to side with these men." Marcus grinned, the same twisted smile Josiah remembered from their childhood, the one that had always meant trouble. "You were always the good one, Josiah," he said. "But this world doesn't run on goodness. It runs on power. And right now, I've got it. So do Whitmore and Kane. You're outnumbered, little brother. And you're going to learn the hard way that family loyalty doesn't count for much when the money's on the table." The tension in the saloon thickened, and Josiah could feel the room closing in. He had to act fast, but before he could take another step, Rose's voice rang out from the back, steady and clear, cutting through the chaos. "Enough, Marcus." Everyone in the room froze. Rose had stood there, silent and afraid for so long, but now her voice was commanding, strong. "I'm not some pawn in your little game," she continued, her eyes locked on Marcus. "And I'm not about to let you or anyone else treat me like property. I'm not afraid of you, Marcus. And I'm not afraid of Whitmore or Kane either." Josiah turned to look at her, his heart swelling with a pride he didn't know he could still feel. Rose was no longer the scared girl he had seen moments before. She had turned into something stronger, something that made him believe they might actually have a chance to win. Marcus's eyes narrowed at her words, and for a brief moment, Josiah saw a flicker of something akin to regret flash across his older brother's face. But it quickly disappeared, replaced by the hard edge of a man who had sold his soul for power. "Don't be foolish, girl," Marcus said, his voice cold. "You're in over your head." But Rose didn't flinch. "Not anymore," she said. The room was dead silent as they all stood, waiting for the next move. Josiah's hand hovered over his gun, his heart pounding. The fate of the room, and of Rose, rested on the next few seconds. The smoke in the saloon thickened, swirling like a storm ready to break. Josiah's gaze never left his brother, his heart aching with a mix of anger and sorrow. His family had been torn apart by choices, by the paths they'd each walked. But this was something different. This was betrayal, pure and simple, and it had to be stopped. "Marcus," Josiah called again, his voice carrying the weight of years of unspoken words. "This doesn't have to end like this. We could have done things differently, together. I offered you a chance to rebuild, to make something honest of this land." Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and cold. "You were always the fool, Josiah," he said, stepping closer, his voice thick with disdain. "You thought I'd just abandon all this." He gestured to the men around him. "For your idealism? No, little brother. Power is the only thing that counts. And I have it now." Rose stepped forward, her hand still steady on her gun. You've chosen power, but you've forgotten what it costs, she said. And it's going to cost you everything. Josiah turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers with a silent understanding. They were in this together, no matter what came next. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. Rose, the girl who had been sold and discarded, had found her voice. And now she was standing with him, a fierce partner in this fight for justice. But Marcus wasn't finished. You're wasting your breath, he spat, his hand tightening around the handle of his revolver. This ends now. Without warning, the chaos erupted once more. Gunfire rang out, loud and deafening, splitting the air. Josiah dropped to the floor, instinctively pulling Rose down with him. The bullets whizzed overhead, but Josiah didn't flinch. His focus was on Marcus, on the man who had once been his brother, but now was nothing more than an enemy to be taken down. Josiah reached for his own revolver, his fingers moving with the precision of a man who had fought in more than one battle. He wasn't afraid of facing Marcus, even though every muscle in his body screamed for him to back away, to save himself. The fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about doing what was right, even if it meant losing everything. Get to the back, Judge Blackwood shouted over the chaos. He had been in the saloon, but now the old judge moved with purpose, his hand steady as he returned fire. Get to the tunnel now. Josiah nodded to Rose, pulling her up and urging her to move quickly. They couldn't let the smoke or the violence suffocate them. They needed to make it to the back to safety. But as they moved, Josiah saw Marcus. The man was coming straight for them, his gun raised, fury in his eyes. You can't outrun your past, Josiah, Marcus yelled, his voice distorted by the gunfire. Rose didn't hesitate. She turned, aimed, and fired, her shot finding its mark in Marcus' shoulder, sending him staggering back. For a moment, time stood still. Marcus looked down at the blood soaking through his shirt, disbelief flashing across his face. Josiah couldn't tell if it was pain or regret in his brother's eyes, but whatever it was, it lasted only a second before he recovered, rage overtaking him once more. You damn fool, Marcus hissed, gripping his side as he aimed his gun at Josiah, desperation in his movements. You're going to pay for this. But as the smoke from the gunfire cleared, Josiah saw something that made his heart seize. The back door of the saloon had already been blown open, and the tunnel that Rose had mentioned was now their only chance to escape. Without thinking, Josiah grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the rear of the saloon. Get out now, Judge Blackwood shouted, his revolver still drawn. He was covering them, but even he could feel the tide of battle shifting. The smoke and confusion created a brief window of opportunity, and Josiah was determined not to waste it. They reached the tunnel, their footsteps muffled on the earth beneath them. The narrow passageway offered no comfort, but it was their best shot. The sound of gunfire grew more distant, but Josiah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. He glanced back at Rose, who was breathing heavily but seemed undeterred. You did good, Josiah said, his voice rough. I don't think any of us would have made it out without you. Rose looked up at him, her eyes softening. I'm not done yet, she said quietly, her hand tightening around her revolver. There's still more to be done. Josiah didn't know what to say to that. They had made it to the tunnel, but there was still a long way to go before they could claim victory. The war against Whitmore, Kane, and Marcus wasn't over yet. But for the first time, Josiah felt like they had a chance. The tunnel led them to the back of the town, where they found the sheriff's office hidden in the shadows. They weren't safe yet, but at least they were out of the immediate line of fire. Josiah pressed his back to the wall, his breath ragged. Now what? Rose asked, her voice steady but filled with the weight of everything they had been through. Josiah turned to her, his mind working quickly. They couldn't just let Marcus and Whitmore slip away. They had to end it all. Now we finish this, Josiah said, his voice firm. Together. The two of them shared a brief look, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. Outside, the sound of galloping hooves reached their ears. They knew the battle wasn't over yet, but they were ready. The choice they had made was clear. In the Old West, survival came with a price. But justice? That was worth fighting for. Josiah Freeman's heart pounded in his chest as he stood in the dim light of the sheriff's office. The air in the tunnel had been thick with the scent of earth and dust, but now, in the cool space behind the office, everything felt still, too still. He could hear the distant gallop of horses, the faint echo of gunfire from the saloon, and the growing urgency in the silence around him. They had come too far, survived too much, to back down now. Rose stood beside him, her eyes scanning the narrow window. Her hand rested on her revolver, poised, ready for the next fight. She had been the unexpected hero in this mess, a woman whose strength and intelligence had turned the tables on Whitmore's men. But Josiah saw the toll it had taken on her. She was no longer the same frightened girl he had seen moments ago. She was a warrior, shaped by the fire of survival, but even the toughest of fighters had their limits. "They're coming," Rose said, her voice steady but with an edge of something Josiah couldn't place. Fear? Or perhaps the calm before the storm. Josiah looked at her, his heart heavy. "We can't let them get away with it," he said. "Not after everything they've done." "I know," Rose replied, "but it's not just about stopping them. It's about making sure they never hurt anyone again." The words hung in the air like a promise. Josiah had known many battles in his life, but this one felt different. The stakes weren't just his survival anymore. They were about redemption, about ending the darkness that had plagued this land for so long. Through the window, he saw the figures of men on horseback moving steadily through the dust toward the sheriff's office. His pulse quickened. He had hoped for a moment of reprieve, a chance to regroup, but there was no time. The fight was upon them. "Stay behind me," Josiah ordered, his voice low. He wasn't about to let Rose get caught in the crossfire. She had done more than enough to earn her freedom, and now it was his turn to protect her. Rose gave him a look, one that spoke volumes. She wasn't someone to hide behind anyone, not anymore. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her eyes fierce. "We do this together." Josiah nodded, his heart swelling with pride. He had once been a man alone, a man fighting for his land, his legacy. But now, standing with Rose, he realized how much stronger they were together. She had given him hope, something he hadn't felt in years. And it was that hope that fueled him as the men closed in on their position. The door burst open. 3 men stepped inside, their guns drawn, eyes scanning the room. Josiah didn't hesitate. He moved like lightning, grabbing the nearest chair and tossing it toward one of the men. It crashed into his chest, knocking him off balance, just long enough for Josiah to draw his own weapon. A shot rang out, and the man crumpled to the floor. Rose was already moving, her rifle aimed at the second man. With a single shot, he dropped, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. The last man hesitated for only a second, his eyes darting toward his fallen comrades. But it was too late. Josiah's gun was already in his hand, and before the man could react, Josiah fired. The shot was clean, precise. The room fell silent. The dust in the air settled, and for a moment, Josiah and Rose just stood there, breathing hard, processing what had just happened. The fight, it seemed, had just begun, but they had won the first round. Josiah stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Is there anyone else?" he asked, his voice cold. There was no answer at first, but then the sound of hooves growing louder filled the air, and Josiah knew more were coming. The battle was far from over, and the real fight was still ahead. Rose looked at him, her expression resolute. "We got one shot at this. We can't let them take control again." Josiah nodded. He was done running, done hiding. He had spent too many years living in fear of what would happen if he stood up to the powerful men who thought they owned the land and the people. But today it was different. Today, he was fighting for something bigger than himself. They gathered their weapons, preparing for the inevitable showdown. The world outside was still, but Josiah could feel the tension in the air. The law had been bought and sold for too long in Dusty Creek. It was time for that to end. Rose took her place beside him, her gaze hard and focused. "This isn't just about money anymore, Josiah," she said quietly. "It's about justice." He looked at her, the weight of her words settling into his chest. Justice. It wasn't a word that came easy in the Old West. but it was the one thing that could set them free. He had lived too long in a world where the corrupt ruled and the innocent suffered. But no more. This fight was for them. For everyone who had ever been sold, beaten, or betrayed by men who thought they could do whatever they wanted. The door creaked open again, and Josiah saw them. More riders, more men who had come to do Whitmore's bidding. But this time, Josiah wasn't alone. This time, he had something worth fighting for. The first shots rang out, but Josiah and Rose were ready. Their shots were quick, their aim deadly. The men who had terrorized this town for far too long began to fall, one by one. The fight was chaotic, desperate, but Josiah's resolve was unshakable. He wasn't going to let them take this from him, not after everything he had fought for. But as the gunfire settled and the last of the men lay still, Josiah knew it wasn't over. Not yet. There was one last battle to be fought, and it would come with a price. But for the first time in his life, Josiah felt something he hadn't in years: hope. Rose was right. Justice wasn't just a word. It was a promise. And Josiah Freeman had just made it. The smoke from the gunfire lingered in the air, curling around the rafters of the saloon like the last breath of a dying storm. The noise had died down, the world outside the saloon quiet for the first time in hours. Josiah Freeman stood in the center of the room, the weight of his gun in his holster feeling heavier than ever before. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that still surged through his veins. Rose stood beside him, her eyes scanning the wreckage of the saloon. The bodies of Whitmore's men lay scattered across the floor, and the stench of gunpowder and sweat hung thick in the air. Her gaze softened when she turned to Josiah, but there was no fear in her eyes now, only resolve. "We did it," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something else, something deeper, something that Josiah couldn't quite place. Maybe it was relief, maybe it was the weight of what they had just done. Josiah nodded, his breath still coming in shallow gasps. "Yeah, but it's not over yet." Rose looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Josiah stepped toward the window, his eyes focused on the horizon. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land. Dust swirled in the wind, and he could hear the faint clip-clop of hooves in the distance. "More are coming," he said quietly. "Marcus will be back, and when he does, it won't just be him. He'll bring more men, more firepower. This isn't over, Rose. Not by a long shot." The sound of boots on wood echoed behind them, and Josiah spun around, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. But it wasn't a gunfight that greeted him. Judge Blackwood stepped into the saloon, his weathered face grim but determined. His coat billowed behind him as he surveyed the room, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. His presence was commanding, but it wasn't the kind of authority that Josiah had grown used to in these parts. This man was different. Blackwood had earned his respect, and for the first time, Josiah felt like they had a chance to end this nightmare once and for all. Blackwood's gaze landed on Josiah, and for a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. No words were needed. They both knew what had happened, and they both understood what was coming next. "I heard the shots," Blackwood said, his voice low and measured. "You've made quite a mess of things, Freeman." "I wasn't the one who started it," Josiah replied, his voice thick with frustration. "Whitmore and his men have been running this town like their own personal kingdom. They've used people, women like Rose, to line their pockets. And I'm not going to sit by and let it happen anymore." Blackwood nodded, his gaze shifting to Rose. "I know what you've done, Miss Ollie. You've done what no one else had the courage to do. And for that, you have my thanks." Rose met his gaze, her eyes narrowing. "Don't thank me yet, Judge. This isn't over. I'm not going to stop until every last one of them is brought to justice." Josiah felt a flicker of hope in his chest. Rose was right. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. There were still men out there, men like Marcus, who would stop at nothing to tear them down. And there was still the question of what would happen to the land, the water rights that Josiah had fought so hard for. If Whitmore's influence reached this far, who knew how deep the corruption ran? "We need to finish this," Josiah said, his voice firm. We can't let them get away. We need to strike before they regroup, before they get any more reinforcements. Blackwood looked at him, his face unreadable. And you think you can take them on alone? Josiah shook his head. I'm not alone. I've got you. And I've got Rose. Together, we can end this. Rose nodded, stepping forward. I'm not going anywhere. If Marcus is coming, we'll face him head on. But this time, it won't be just him and his men. We got something they don't, justice on our side. Blackwood's lips twitched in what could have been the beginning of a smile. You're a stubborn one, Freeman. But I admire that. Josiah looked at the judge, a plan already forming in his mind. We need to take the fight to them. Go after Marcus before he can regroup. I know where he'll be, the old mine up on Red Hill. It's the last place they'll expect us to hit. We could trap him there, cut off his escape route. Blackwood considered it for a moment. That's a risky move. It's the only move, Josiah replied. We can't wait for them to come to us. We need to take the fight to them and finish it before they have a chance to retaliate. The judge nodded slowly. All right, but we do this my way. I'll bring the law, official reinforcements. You two are good fighters, but this isn't just about guns. We'll need strategy. Josiah agreed. It wasn't just about firepower. It was about outthinking their enemies, outmaneuvering them before they had a chance to strike back. This was their moment, their chance to make things right. Let's go, Josiah said, his voice filled with resolve. It's time to end this. As they prepared to ride out, Josiah felt a deep sense of purpose. The fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the land, about protecting the people who had no voice in this corrupt system. It was about Rose, this woman who had become more than a victim, who had become a partner, someone who would stand by him through the fire and the smoke. The wind howled through the dusty streets of Dusty Creek, carrying with it the scent of imminent change. Josiah knew that the battle ahead would be the hardest of his life. But he also knew that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't fighting alone. The Old West was a brutal place, a land where justice was often as scarce as water, and survival was a constant struggle. But as Josiah Freeman rode into the sunset with Rose and Judge Blackwood at his side, he felt something more than just the weight of the gun on his hip. He felt the weight of redemption, of justice finally being served in a land that had long been forgotten by the law. The ride to Red Hill was long, but it was filled with something Josiah hadn't known in years: hope. The sun was low on the horizon as Josiah, Rose, and Judge Blackwood made their way toward Red Hill, the shadows of the vast desert stretching long and foreboding across the ground. The landscape around them was unforgiving, dusty, barren, and filled with the sharp, harsh scent of sagebrush. The wind kicked up small clouds of dirt, whipping their faces as they rode steadily forward, knowing that everything they had worked for, everything they had fought for, would come to a head in the next few hours. Josiah's heart hammered in his chest as he scanned the horizon. He had spent years building his cattle operation, fighting for every inch of land, every ounce of respect that he had earned. And now, it seemed as though his past, the blood, sweat, and tears that had gone into this life, was about to be tested in a way he never could have imagined. How far do you think we've got? Rose asked from behind him, her voice carrying across the wind. Josiah glanced over his shoulder. Her face was steady now, the fear from the saloon gone, replaced with the same fierce determination that had driven her through everything. There was no hint of hesitation in her eyes as she looked at him, no sign of regret. She had made her choice, just as he had made his. Together, they would face Marcus and the rest of Whitmore's men. Not far, he said, tightening his grip on the reins. Maybe an hour. Blackwood, riding beside Josiah, said nothing. He was a man of few words, his presence in the saddle a calm force that seemed to quiet the otherwise tense atmosphere. There was no need for him to speak. His experience was his voice, and it was understood in the way he carried himself, in the way he made decisions without flinching. I've been through Red Hill before, Blackwood said, breaking the silence. If Marcus is there, we'll find him, but we'll need to move fast. His men will be dug in by now. They'll be expecting us. Josiah nodded. We've got the element of surprise. They won't be ready for the three of us. Rose adjusted her grip on her rifle. It's not just about surprise. We need to be smart about this. If we go in guns blazing, we'll be outnumbered and outgunned. We have to take them down one by one. Josiah felt a surge of admiration for Rose. In the short time they had known each other, she had become more than just an ally. She had become an equal. She wasn't some helpless victim waiting to be rescued. She was a warrior, a woman who knew how to survive in a world where survival often meant outthinking your enemies rather than outshooting them. Agreed, Josiah said. We'll move quietly. Take them out from a distance if we can. If it comes to fight, we fight smart. The rest of the ride was spent in tense silence, each of them focused on the task ahead. As the hours passed, the landscape around them began to change. The hills of Red Hill rose up in the distance, jagged and unforgiving. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, dark shadows across the land. The quiet stillness of the desert seemed to hold its breath as they drew closer. When they reached the base of the hill, Josiah signaled for them to stop. He motioned for Rose and Blackwood to dismount, and the three of them moved cautiously toward the rise. We'll leave the horses here, Josiah whispered, his voice low. We can't risk them giving away our position. The ground was rocky and uneven, but they moved with practiced ease, slipping through the underbrush and toward the top of the hill. As they reached the crest, Josiah held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. He crouched low, peering over the edge at the camp below. There were at least a dozen men gathered around a campfire, their voices carrying in the still night air. Marcus Freeman sat at the center, his broad shoulders hunched as he spoke with one of the men. Josiah could see the tension in his brother's posture, the way his eyes darted around, aware of everything and nothing at the same time. Now's our chance, Blackwood said, his voice barely above a whisper. We take them out quietly, one by one. Josiah nodded. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They would split up, using the cover of darkness to take out as many of Marcus' men as they could. It would be a battle of precision, a test of their ability to strike without being seen. Rose crouched beside him, her rifle ready. She glanced up at Josiah, her eyes sharp and focused. We're doing the right thing, Josiah, she said, her voice steady. We've come too far to turn back now. Josiah's heart clenched at her words. He had never expected this, never expected to find himself in this fight, with this woman against his own flesh and blood. But there was no turning back now. He had made his choice, and he would live or die by it. We move on my signal, Josiah said, his voice firm. The next few minutes felt like hours. The wind howled across the hill, carrying with it the distant sound of the campfire crackling below. Josiah's pulse raced in his ears as he waited, watching Marcus through the scope of his rifle. His brother had no idea what was coming. Then, with a deep breath, Josiah gave the signal. The three of them moved as one, swift and silent. Rose took the first shot, dropping a man by the fire before anyone could react. Josiah followed quickly, picking off two more from the edge of the camp. Blackwood moved with the precision of a man who had seen countless battles, taking down another two men in the blink of an eye. But Marcus wasn't an idiot. As soon as he realized what was happening, he drew his gun and called for his men to take cover. Chaos erupted in the camp as gunfire rang out, but Josiah and the others were already in motion. They had the advantage of surprise, but the fight was far from over. Marcus ducked behind a boulder, his eyes scanning the hill for any sign of Josiah. His voice rang out in the night air, sharp and commanding. Freeman, you want to fight? Then come down here and face me like a man. Josiah's heart twisted at the sound of his brother's voice. He wanted to hate Marcus, to condemn him for everything he had done, but the bond between them was still there, hidden beneath the years of betrayal and pain. They were family, and that was a weight Josiah would carry for the rest of his life. But family or not, Marcus had crossed a line, and tonight, Josiah would make sure that line was never crossed again. The night sky over Red Hill was a blanket of darkness, broken only by the flicker of gunfire and the distant flash of flames from the burning saloon. The desert wind howled across the rocks, carrying the bitter scent of smoke and the heavy silence that followed the chaos of battle. Josiah Freeman stood at the crest of the hill, his heart pounding as the last echoes of gunfire faded into the distance. The fight had been brutal, but it was over now. Rose Ollie had proven herself not just a survivor, but a force to be reckoned with. Judge Blackwood had fought with the precision of a man who knew that the law could be bent but never broken. And Josiah? He had faced his brother, the man who had once been his closest kin, only to learn that blood, too, could be corrupted by greed and desperation. But as the dust settled and the bodies of Marcus' men lay scattered in the ruins of the camp, Josiah couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. He looked down at his brother, who had fallen behind a rock, wounded but still breathing. The flames from the saloon had cast long shadows across Marcus' face, his expression a mixture of rage and regret. Josiah felt no joy in seeing him there, lying in the dirt. There was no satisfaction in the victory that had cost him so much. He stepped forward, gun in hand, but it wasn't pointed at Marcus. It was aimed at the dirt beneath his feet, a symbol of the weight of the choices he had made. "Marcus," Josiah called out, his voice low, the words heavy with the years of silence between them. "This doesn't have to end like this." Marcus didn't answer at first. He just stared up at Josiah, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, finally, his lips parted, and a bitter smile crept across his face. "You always were the good one, Josiah," Marcus muttered, his voice tinged with exhaustion and defeat. "Always trying to save everyone, always trying to do what's right." His eyes flickered to the bodies of his men, the men who had followed him into this fight, and something shifted in his gaze. "But look at me now. Look at what I've become. You should have known this was coming." Josiah knelt beside him, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like the unforgiving sun in the desert. "You made your choices, Marcus," Josiah said quietly. "But you're not the man I thought you were. I offered you a way out. I offered you a partnership, a chance to rebuild, to live a better life. But you chose this path. You chose the money, the power, and now you've lost everything." Marcus' smile faltered, and for a moment, Josiah saw a glimpse of the man he had once known, a boy, hungry for the same thing Josiah had always wanted: respect, love, a future. But that boy had been swallowed up by something darker, something that had driven him to make deals with men like Whitmore, to feed off the suffering of others. "I never wanted this, Josiah," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse. "But it's too late. It's too late for me." Josiah's fingers tightened around his gun, but he didn't pull the trigger. He couldn't, not with his brother lying there, broken, staring up at him with a look of regret that pierced deeper than any bullet ever could. "You still have a chance," Josiah said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you have to make it. I can't make it for you." Marcus' eyes flickered toward the burning saloon, the chaos still raging behind him. Then, slowly, he nodded, his body trembling from the pain. "I know," he said, his voice quiet, "but I don't think I can make it out of this one." With that, Marcus closed his eyes, and Josiah stood up, his heart heavy. He looked back toward Rose and Blackwood, who had managed to pull together what was left of the fight. Rose's eyes met his, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something that made Josiah wonder if, despite everything, she saw something in him that he hadn't seen in himself. They had survived, but survival was only the first step. As the smoke from the burning saloon curled up into the night sky, Josiah knew that his life, and Rose's, would never be the same. They had crossed a line, taken a stand that few men dared to take. But there was no turning back now, and there never would be. 3 months later, Josiah Freeman stood on the porch of his ranch, watching the sun set over the mountains that framed the horizon. The wind had died down, and the land was still, silent but alive. The cattle grazed lazily in the fields, and for the first time in years, Josiah felt a sense of peace settle over him. The war he had fought, both against his brother and against the men who had sought to destroy everything he had worked for, was over. But the battle for his soul, his redemption, was just beginning. Rose Ollie had become more than just a partner in the ranch. She had become his equal, his ally in a world that often seemed determined to tear them apart. Together, they had built something new, a life, a future, and it was theirs. Marcus, too, had found a new path. He had been sentenced to prison, but the judge, impressed by his actions in the final moments of the fight, had given him a chance at parole. It wasn't much, but it was something. "I think we've got a chance, Josiah," Rose said one evening as they sat on the porch together, watching the sky turn from gold to purple. "A real chance." Josiah turned to look at her, his heart full. "We do," he said, his voice steady. "And it's ours. All of it." The past would always be with them, lurking like the shadows in the desert. But it was no longer something to fear. They had faced it, fought it, and survived. And now, they had a future. Together. In the end, redemption wasn't about grand gestures or perfect endings. It was about the small choices, the ones that changed everything, the ones that led them here. To do right when everything's wrong, Josiah thought, his eyes following the last rays of sunlight as they disappeared behind the hills. That's how we make our own way in this world. And for Josiah Freeman, Rose Ollie, and the people who had stood by them, that was enough. The rest would come in time.